I came to study African Americans in the Midwest by accident of the place I was in and what I do. So I'm a college professor at UW-Madison. I teach introductory classes in African American history. I also teach, seminars and things like slavery and capitalism and gender and slavery. But in my introductory class, I wanted to be sure to be talking about the space that we were in. So I didn't just want everything to be about what had happened in the South or what had happened in the Northeast. I didn't really know much about, even though I am myself a Midwesterner. And much of my teaching focused on the South because I specialize in the history of slavery. And so I wasn't expecting to find a whole lot. And I went to the Wisconsin Historical Society, and really, to my surprise, I found out that there were Black people in Wisconsin long before it was Wisconsin. And Black people have been in this space since at least the 1720s. And that was news to me. And so I got really interested. I'm like, okay, what can I bring to my students? And I started looking for the book. Okay, where's the book on Black people in early Wisconsin? Where's the book on slavery? Where's the book on Black freedom? And I couldn't find it. There are just a couple of outdated books that talked about slavery in Wisconsin being gentle and different, that were published, at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, when historians of slavery assumed wrongly that slavery in the North was somehow mild, better, or not as exploitative and brutal. And I thought, this is written in 1896. I think this is in need of a revision. And so that's how it became a book project for me. I always like to focus on how Black people built lives for themselves regardless of the situation that they were in. Because oftentimes, African American history is dominated by a narrative of what was done to people. And that assumes that people didn't do things for themselves, that they didn't resist, that they didn't build full lives within the constructs of slavery and discrimination. And the historical record tells us that that is exactly what happened, right? You can't tell the history of Black people without telling a history of resistance, a history of resilience, and a history of joy. Black people found joy regardless of the situations that they were in. And so often the focus is on what was done to them, not what they did for themselves or their contributions to that society. And so that's something that I always focus on because I try to stay true to the historical record. And the historical record is full of what Black people did for themselves. They were not simply acted upon. They were fully fleshed out human beings just like you and me. And they responded to the situations they were in a multitude of ways. And that's true in the Midwest and in the South and in the Northeast. And I think it's especially important in places in the Midwest because the Midwest has this myth of racelessness, right? That there's no history of anti-Black racism to overcome, that Black people came to this region post-World War II, that there's no long history of Black people in the Midwest. Or when I find myself on the coast and I tell people I'm from the Midwest or I'm a Midwesterner and that's how I describe myself, they kind of look at me confused because Midwest and white are often used as, interchangeable code words, as if there's not Black people in the Midwest, as if there's not a long history of Black people in the Midwest. I always try to focus in on what Black people did for themselves in a space where people think that there weren't any Black people. And I think that that is intensely important. Oftentimes when I tell people what I'm doing, they look at me confused. White people will often look at me confused. And when you look at the history of who's been in this space, most white Wisconsinites trace their history back to the 19th century. Well, there were Black people here hundreds of years before that. I remember being a kid in school, and I hated any time they talked about early African American history, particularly slavery. And I grew up in a majority white community. I went to a majority white school, and I remember just wanting to disappear because they talked about all of these horrible things that happened to Black people. And I sat there and thought, well, why didn't they do anything? And that is incredibly damaging. It wasn't until I was in graduate school that I started getting a fully fleshed out version of American history. And I realized I was irate. I was like, we fought back. We resisted. We sued. We ran away. We demanded citizenship. We helped build this nation. Why isn't that part of the narrative? And that narrative is essential. Because when you're someone who's just acted upon, when you're not a contributor, when you're not a resistor, then you are not important. You are a sideline. You aren't an inheritor of anything that's important. You're not part of the citizenry. You're not part of the nation builders. You're just acted upon. And it allows for this really dangerous fiction that Black people are undeserving, that Black people are outside of the American story, or that they're an aside to the American story, rather than being front and center, which they were. So what I learned in grad school and what I try to teach my students through primary sources, right? So things that tell us about the past from the past, is that the history of Black people is a history of fighting for freedom. It's a history of resistance, and you cannot understand the creation, the formation, and the maintenance of the United States of America unless you understand African American history. That it's not an aside, it is central to.